Hey everyone, back again. Okay, let us continue with Patricia Hill Collins' Black Feminist Thought. We're going to start from here from chapter 5 all the way to the end. So let's just jump into it with chapter 5, the power of self-definition. Now, as we were talking about last time, one of the tools of colonial white supremacist authority is to try and not to take people as they are, but instead to impose images upon them, to impose certain racist stereotypes that can work in the service of normalizing colonial or white supremacist aggression and to justify further control over those people. Because if they are just branded in a certain way with certain stereotypes, they are effectively dehumanized. And by being dehumanized, their capacity for autonomy is taken away from them. So given this, it has been one of the prerogatives or one of the elements of Black feminist thought to offer oppositional definitions and images of Black women to oppose these racist caricatures. So it is important to highlight that Black women have not simply surrendered to these images, to these oppressions. They have mobilized dynamic strategies to oppose their exploitation and their discrimination, which is the case for anybody ever who experiences oppression. Now, one of the harms, and this is a common trap when discussing legacies of colonialism, of violence, of systemic violence, is that victims are reduced to the experience of their oppressors. So in the case of indigenous people in North America, for example, in the many different indigenous nations, their history within the current Canadian civic mind frame begins when colonialism starts, which is interesting. So it implies as though there was no history before then, and the only history that people learn about today of these people, aside from maybe a footnote or two, is the way that these people interacted with their eventual genociders through European colonialists. And even if this is critiqued, it still maintains this colonial mind frame of treating it as though colonialism in the Americas was the beginning of history there. So it is important to also rectify that, to offer different images and acknowledge different histories that far predate, obviously, colonialism, and is not reducible to that, while also acknowledging that this was obviously a horrendous, violent, significant event for millions and millions of people's lives and communities. Now, Hill Collins says in the case of Black women, because of the specific position that they occupy as being as blurring the distinction between genders in the way that we talked about last time, where Black women were expected to do all kinds of work, to also blurring the boundaries between classes. Now, what I mean by that is that Black women would often be hired into rich white homes, and so they would actually be integrated a lot of the time into those homes, not in a positive way, but they'd be integrated into those homes and integrated into those lives while being maintained as an invisible other within that dynamic. And so by virtue of that, they occupied a certain vantage point, a unique vantage point within which to navigate and to negotiate their own experiences and to unify around this common cause that didn't have, or this common experience that didn't have the same kind of deep, thought out activist movement behind it like the civil rights movement did, that largely represented the interests and the experiences of Black men. Black women didn't have the same kind of representation in those spaces, and so they were forced to then come up with their own self-representation, do their own strategies, which a lot of the time could just be individual strategies, but were nevertheless necessary for these women to keep themselves alive and to earn money to feed their children. So spaces like women's organizations, parks, churches, buses, all came to serve as sites of identity construction for Black women that were separate from the hegemonic constructions and stereotypes and images that emanated from other institutions like schools, like newspapers, like politicians, like doctors' offices that contributed to the steady, recurrent dehumanization of Black women. Now, of course, these processes are met with resistance, both direct resistance and then more abstract, institutionalized, systemic resistance. Because when people who have been systematically oppressed begin to try to reclaim their identity, to oppose the images and stereotypes imposed upon them, this is taken by the privileged group, the oppressors, as being a sign of aggression, because it conflicts with their worldview of these people, a worldview grounded within oppression and discrimination, but their worldview nevertheless. And so it's important, and Hill Collins really emphasizes this, it's really important that this isn't just a task that's undertaken by Black women as a mode of survival and of activism and community organization, but it is also something that privileged folks need to take on as well, to teach other privileged folks about how these efforts are not threatening to them, and to invite their reflection as to why they might feel threatened by these efforts. And you see this today in so many different ways, not just against Black women, even though they certainly do receive this kind of criticism, but there are many different activist groups, especially some Marxist ones, that get really annoyed if you try to bring up other struggles, because then that's taken as being diluting the urgency of the Marxist struggle. And with that, then, is seen that there's only one legitimate struggle, and everybody else's it should just take a back seat. And so efforts by Black women to oppose their exploitation, or even Black women to work together to find better ways to support their families financially, has sometimes been interpreted by certain Marxist circles as being participating in their oppression, because they believe that this is part of maybe an entrepreneurial spirit, or they're participating in capitalism in a way that makes them traitorous. This is also the history of scabs within striking action. So a scab is a kind of temporary employee that an employer will hire if their employees are on strike. Now, in the case of the segregated South or segregated United States, scabs were often Black people who couldn't find work anywhere else. And so this fomented, this cultivated a lot of anger and a lot of the segregationist and racist attitudes of unions that viewed Black people as being traitorous to them in their true, what they believed to be the one true struggle. Now, it's important, that's why it's important to hold on to the idea that actually all of these struggles can be dealt with at the same time. It's not as though we can imagine a communist revolution to transform the world, but imagining the end of racism is too far. Obviously, that's ridiculous. Both of these things can happen at the same time, in fact, and they're very much connected. Now, of course, there have been so many other arenas in which Black women have tried to reclaim an identity, or to reclaim it. Using that language implies as though they actually lost it, which is part of the oppressive script, is to really give the oppressor way more power than they actually have had. But regardless, to one of the ways that Black women have struggled to take this image, or to create their own images, is through music and fiction and cuisine. And they've acted as sites to resist hegemonic constructions of Black women while exemplifying Black women's irreplaceable contributions to those fields, as they've been systematically erased from them. So, for example, Alice Childress's, one of the family, specifically Mildred's character, who stresses her oppressed status as a domestic, so as a domestic worker, she even takes on this identity, but it's a way by which to emphasize the way in which hiring domestic labor is a process of dehumanizing someone. They stop being a human being and start to become only a domestic. They're just a worker. There's nothing more to them than that. And these creative efforts have also exemplified and really elaborated the need for safe spaces for Black women to be able to speak their minds freely, to describe their experiences with white supremacy, with sexism, in a way where they won't be immediately criticized. And this is often the nature of white and masculine fragility, is that as soon as somebody raises a criticism, like I said before, they take it as threatening to them. they take it as though they are being attacked. It's so common, especially when criticizing men or proposing just even the most basic criticism of what is hegemonic male culture in the West. It's immediately met with resistance, or as though it's divisive, when Black women and even just women in general endure these kinds of way more violent, vitriolic discourse on a daily basis than men ever do. But men are intolerant to it. For men, they are meant to believe as though the world should bend to them from every moment they're alive. Everything must conform to their expectation of it. The same with white supremacy. And anything that resists that is then taken as being a threat to that world. So in a sense, those safe spaces in this construction here are quite exclusionary. They create spaces for Black women in this context to discuss without fear of white tears or white fragility or somebody being offended, where they can actually discuss how they will organize their activism, their community engagement, their care for one another in ways that opposes the institutionalized capture of these things. Like in the West, we have institutions that fill in for everything. European-oriented institutions. Like if you're sick, we have the institution for that. If you're feeling mentally unwell, we have an institution for that. Those two things are different, but in any case, you have to learn, we have an institution for that, so on and so forth. But these institutions then, because they are neatly attached to a very specific continent and a very specific historical and cultural legacy, are by nature exclusionary. What children learn in schools reflects a very specific worldview. Anyone who grew up in the West, look through your school history textbooks and you find that actually the version of history that you learn is a very specific one. And given the entirety of history, it's incredibly narrow. You look through your history textbooks and you probably read about way more white dudes than you do anyone else. Were they the only people in history? No. Were they the ones that held the most power? Yes. But why is it that we equate the learning of history with learning about people with the most power? In those contexts, of course. We're not thinking about various kingdoms and rulers throughout the many different African countries. Of course, that's not allowed. But it just goes to show the way these institutions participate in normalizing and naturalizing racism and sexism and historical revisionism in the service of these oppressions. So Hill Collins stresses that for Black women, the process of self-discovery, though, has not been a purely individualized one. Whereas in the case for many white women, especially in the case of second wave feminism, where if I'm just going to, that's very reductive to use the term second wave feminism, but if you'll entertain me, second wave feminism, one of its big efforts was to get women out of the home. Of course, the subtext here was that it was just white women. Black women are always out of the home. They were always having to work. They always had other things to do. Whereas white women, their process of self-discovery was an individual one a lot of the time. It was about their becoming financially autonomous. It was about them developing interests outside of the imposed gendered expectations and parenting expectations often put onto them. But in the case of Black women, Hill Collins stresses that self-discovery and self-definition, it hasn't prioritized the self in the same way. Instead, Black women, it's emphasized like Black women's senses of self, they're often attached to community and family and ancestry. So she says that there are 4 pillars of Black women's self-identity in the construction of a self. And they are, firstly, self-definition, secondly, self-valuation, thirdly, self-reliance and independence, and fourthly, change for personal empowerment. Now, unfortunately, these pillars are often ignored in academic circles whose members often derive from the middle and upper classes, which is just an inherent problem when dealing with many different kinds of oppressions and the way in which colleges and universities have historically claimed to be the sites to engage these kinds of oppressions. Because they're super expensive. Not everyone can afford to go to college, and so it's only going to reflect the experiences of those people of a certain class, certain classes, they're able to access that space. and hence why colleges, universities have historically not been great allies to workers' struggles. Like, of course, we can find exceptions, but I mean, as an institution, they come to replicate the hegemonic status quo of the capitalist elite. And that puts us here into Chapter 6, the sexual politics of Black womanhood. Now, here we're going to discuss, and going forward, we're going to discuss in no great detail cases of sexual violence against Black women. Again, not in any great detail, but of course, this is something that can't be ignored, especially in the ways in which white supremacist patriarchy operates to oppress Black women, the specific ways that it targets Black women. So Black women and girls occupy an ambiguous and contradictory position. On the one hand, white supremacist patriarchy sexualizes Black men and girls. There's this moment in Bell Hooks's Eating the Other when she discusses this experience of listening to college-aged white men deliberately pursuing women of color because they could exoticize and render exotic these women of color, and therefore that was a sign of their being sexually promiscuous. And therefore being, for these boys, they were seeing these women as being sexual, like elements of sexual adventure, which has often been bestowed upon Black women. Now, the contradictory element here is that on the one hand, sexuality is deployed and imposed upon these women, while it is also denied. While Black women are also denied space and attention to discuss their experiences with their own sexualities, be it their own understandings of their sexuality, their navigation of sexuality with other Black women, what it means among them all, and also their mutual experiences of sexual violence by men, which is something that they are not encouraged to discuss, while also being hypersexualized. And when Black women are encouraged to speak about it, they're expected to do so with constant reference to their race. So Hill Collins stresses that when it is discussed, it should be discussed in the context of racism, not necessarily in the context of sexism. So in her words, white men's sexual assault of Black women during slavery can be discussed, whereas Black men's sexual assault of Black women today cannot. And this is like the nature of intersectionality, of course. It's recognizing how different people, by virtue of different identity markers and different experiences of oppression and different positions they occupy, come to negotiate and navigate power differently, where Black men exist within a white supremacist paradigm very differently than Black women. And so Black men might experience racism while also enjoying some of the privileges of patriarchal power. So then, in cases like these, Black women coming forward about cases of sexual violence against them conducted by Black men can be seen as traitorous or seen as being a hindrance to the Black liberation movement. So many decades ago, there was the case of Anita Hill, who accuses Clarence Thomas, who's currently on the Supreme Court, of sexual assault. This is back in the early 90s. And this created a big rift because Black women were obviously siding with Anita Hill, whereas there were many Black men who saw Anita Hill as hindering racial progress in the United States by bringing up this case of sexual assault against a prospective Black entrance into the Supreme Court, or Black addition to the Supreme Court. And this really just goes to show the way that women and girls are just expected to endure so much violence in the name of some kind of a greater good that happens to most often benefit men in whatever context, which doesn't seem to be a coincidence. Black women are also systematically silenced if their sexual testimonies are not about straight relations. So Barbara Smith, for example, argues that one reason for this is that heterosexuality is one privileged orientation open to Black women. So while Black women experience racism and sexism, Barbara Smith says that the one area in which they might be able to not experience a kind of oppression is if they are straight, which obviously many of them weren't, because just many people aren't. And that was something they would have to hide or deny or not discuss, even if they experienced violence in a context like that, because that would then out them to a world that is extremely homophobic or biphobic. And so we can even see cases of Black women being oppressive or being violent towards other Black women for being lesbians. And again, this highlights the intersectional nature of oppression and the various ways in which privilege can be conferred upon people by virtue of them adopting and approximating certain standards, certain ways of living in the world that have been hegemonically imposed through years and years of cultural consolidation and the imposition of power through various institutions. So, and there's so much more to really unpack here, especially in the sexualization of Black women who are they're hypersexualized, but also aren't taken seriously when they come forward about cases of sexual assault. And this is done to elevate especially white women's sexuality as being pure, whereas Black women are somehow deserving of whatever happens to them because of their over-sexual nature. And there's a really great book. I've actually had her on to discuss it. It's Nicole Charles's Suspicion, that talks about vaccine suspicion. Vaccine hesitancy is not the term she uses. She uses suspicion, but just so you know the kind of topic. She talks about vaccine suspicion in Barbados. And I really recommend you check out the book because it's really good. But in it, she discusses the ways in which Black Barbadian women were opposing the HPV vaccine for their daughters, because the HPV vaccine would communicate to them, or at least this is some of the fear, would communicate to their daughters that it's okay to be having sex. When, as a Black woman in that context, it is obviously something that Black women would be very much aware of, having grown up in that world, having known what it is like to be a Black girl, growing up to become a Black woman, and the different ways in which you're being received as a sexual subject means you're going to receive violence. Hence, them wanting to protect their daughters from this identity, which isn't always neat or the most caring, but it does really come out of a place of care. And you really recommend the book for going into great detail about that. And one of the most obvious ways, and Hill Collins is just so obvious about this, is you can look at the contemporary or the present maintenance of racial and gendered relations just by looking at porn. And don't go and do this, but if you look at porn in the various different categories, you see the ways in which Black women's bodies are commodified and exoticized in certain ways that just rehashes colonial archetypes and stereotypes. Same thing against Black men, where these are categories in themselves, whereas the entire gamut of other sexual relations often found in the world of porn is just naturalized and assumed to be white. Same thing plays out in Hollywood. If there's a film that has cast only white people, there's no agenda there. It's just a movie. Whereas if a film is cast with only Black people, then it is taken as being some kind of a political message. Then it is a film about and for Black people. Whereas the film just with white people is ostensibly advertised. It's meant for everybody. And that puts us into chapter 7, Black women's love relationships. So citing Audre Lorde, Hill Collins emphasizes Black women's loving attachments to their communities, their families, and their friends. So if you read Audre Lorde, she talks about various different uses for Black women. She talks about the uses of anger and how anger is very much justified given these legacies of oppression that Black women have endured. She also talks about the uses of intimacy, the uses of pleasure, the uses of all these things in order to break down the individualizing tendencies of white supremacist capitalism that really emphasizes people being separated and treating each other as competitors instead of cooperators, instead of community members. And so Audre Lorde, in her The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, really emphasizes the differing ways in which, or the tools available to Black women to oppose these historical tendencies. So Hill Collins emphasizes that Black men have proven to be a contradictory component of Black women's loving relationships. Now, obviously, Black women can love and have loved and do love the men in their lives, but that doesn't erase the ways that Black men can benefit and have benefited from patriarchy and gender-based violence and exploitation. Now, unlike feminists, though they don't want to give up men, they want Black men to change, in Hill Collins's words, which is, it's a good, obviously valid thing to want. This means dealing with patriarchy on a much broader scale, of course, not to suggest that it is just a white phenomenon. It is something that can be perhaps traced to Europe, especially in its current nuclear family construction, which is a very new thing on the world stage. But in all, and much of the discourse around women's liberation means expanding away and moving away from the American understanding of what patriarchy is to consider how it manifests in different contexts, which is extremely important, and very much like this one, where she really stresses that it's not as though it's like born out of a kind of resentment per se, but rather it's an acknowledgement and a hoping that Black men will acknowledge the ways in which they get to benefit from patriarchy, whereas Black women obviously do not. And so, I mean, the Eurocentric notions of sexuality that treat women's bodies as sites of conquest, as vectors of economic exploitation, as just essentially cattle to produce children, they've had significant consequences on the relationships between Black men and women and Hispanic, Indigenous men and women. If you're interested in this, Maria Lugones wrote an article once. It was called The Heterosexualist Matrix of Colonial Oppression, along those lines, where she talks about the way in which European colonizers not only inflicted colonial genocide on Indigenous folks, but they also imposed certain things that were absolutely unpracticed among many Indigenous people, like gendered dynamics or like the gender binary, which not all people held as being constitutive of their community setting. So what I mean by that is that many different communities across the world didn't use gender as a way by which to like divide up tasks. That European ideas about that would come to influence through direct force many different Indigenous people and to impose a new binary that wasn't fully present before. Not to mention, of course, Eurocentric beauty standards that often just immediately exclude the possibility of non-white people being beautiful, which is one of the colonial tools really one of the first ones to really affect women of color, girls of color, like is depicted in Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, where this young Black girl lives her whole life thinking young life thinking that the only way for her to really be beautiful is if she had white eyes, if she had blue eyes, or if she was white, if she had the hair of white girls, not her own hair. And this is part of this process of colonial alienation, where oppressed people, in this case oppressed girls, Black girls, are encouraged to not associate with themselves or to view themselves as being the hindrance to their happiness. If only she had blue eyes, then she would be happy. When really the question is, if only there wasn't racist conceptions of beauty, would she be happy? But that's a lot harder to identify, especially within a racist colonial setting. Now, there's also the dynamic within Black women's loving relationships where they are seen as being traitorous if they have a relationship with a white man instead of a Black man if they're heterosexual. Whereas it's okay, or relatively okay, for Black men to pursue white women. Maybe not to white men who have historically inflicted a lot of harm on Black men for looking at white women the wrong way, perhaps pursuing white women. Like, obviously, there is that history there. But Hill Collins is just emphasizing how there is this double standard and how there is this exercise of patriarchal power against them in this racist way as well. And all of this really attests to, and Audre Lorde writes about this, and Bell Hooks too, writes about the ways in which Black lesbian relationships are really transgressive. They oppose both Eurocentric notions of couples, which has to be a heterosexual, monogamous couple, opposes that. It opposes the nuclear family dynamic, often encouraging and welcoming different ideas about how families can look and what communities can look like, and hence why Black lesbian women have just been historically such a subjugated group of people. And it simply attests to its how transgressive it is, how much it rubs up against the grain of normative sexism and racism in this context. And that puts us to Chapter 8, Black Women and Motherhood. So that in 1965, there was this report that came out. It's called the Moynihan Report, which is a really fascinating document to understand the normalization of racism within the U.S. context. And this report really popularized the idea that the problems facing Black families is not historical disenfranchisement. It's not legacies of enslavement. It's not anything like that. Instead, it's like absent Black fathers. And this is a very common thing that is still spouted on like Fox and other, kind of clownish right-wing news outlets, is that the problems that Black people face are just problems with individuals and with their maladaptation to institutions like the family. And so in the 60s, the Moynihan Report tried to understand what these things were, what these failings were of the Black family, creating things like higher rates of Black incarceration. Of course, they aren't questioning how the prison system is a for-profit system that benefits from historical racism to justify the easy incarceration of Black people. Of course, they aren't going to talk about that. No, they're going to turn it into an individual thing. How have these Black fathers just like failed? Now, one of the consequences of this absent father phenomenon, of course, again, no mention of how Black men were arbitrarily incarcerated, taken from their homes and children and partners. And one of the consequences of this that the Moynihan Report says is that women were forced to become matriarchal. They were forced to become like domineering. And the Moynihan Report suggests that this is like against nature, essentially. And this is what causes so many problems within Black families, is that there's an absent father and there's an over-present mother. So therefore, this is the problem here. Of course, that totally ignores the ways in which there are many different communities across the world and across time that were matriarchal, in which the woman held the primary role within the home or within any kind of community setting, or women did. And it also ignores those cases in which there weren't clear gender relations, where the play of kind of power in terms of parental authority would oscillate between people. There wasn't just one gender assumed to possess it. So Black motherhood, as it has been historically studied within academic spaces, has taken it to be a problem. Black motherhood is something to be corrected. And in doing so, much of this research and the academic scholarship surrounding it has normalized white motherhood and its attachment to the nuclear family and nuclear monogamous family dynamic. But again, there's a sexist dynamic here where this is replicated by Black men. Hill Collins talks about the experience or the phenomenon of Black men like really celebrating the resiliency of Black women, because they saw what their mothers endured because of being living it through segregation or even enslavement, and then obviously being extremely resilient. This is a racist trope, and it implies as though like Black women just endured like racism and endured enslavement and segregation like anyone could. And of course, that takes the focus away from those oppressions. But Hill Collins talks about the way in which that phenomenon of Black men seeing their mothers endure so much and then expecting the same of their partners, of the women that they would come to date, which is totally unfair. And it also reinscribes the expectation that Black women are meant to be like the caregivers in an age of racism. And much of this relies upon the collapsing of different ideas about motherhood. So there are many different contexts that understand motherhood in different ways. Like, for example, she emphasizes like some elements or some different manifestations of motherhood within African American history and experience and community building, where the mother that gave birth would be seen as like the blood mother, whereas there could be other mothers which still held the title mother. These could be friends, relatives, aunts, cousins, parents, that are taking on the role of raising someone else's children or their grandchildren or whatever. And this not only opposes the nuclear family dynamic, but it opens up different ways of understanding what parenthood is like, and like who can be a parent, what it means to be a parent. And it isn't this like Western conception of the nuclear family dynamic where having children, it means that they're like your property and you own them. You own those children, and no one else can have any kind of like parental authority over them or any kind of like parental duty towards them, because it's like a kind of possessive culture that needs to hold on and to control the things that it possesses. Now, the phenomenon of other mothers and blood mothers, this was partly born out of the legacies of enslavement, where Black women were like a new child would enter into the plantation, or their parents would be taken away, and children would be left alone, and so people would have to take care of these children, and it would often be women. I mean, historically that's the case, is women are the ones who disproportionately take on that kind of caring work. Women would take care of these children, and they would come to occupy this motherly position without being the quote-unquote biological mother, therefore disrupting the idea that the biological parent has more of like a parental right to that child than another caring guardian can. And then the irony is that these Black women would then be essentially persecuted or demonized for doing this, because they are not adhering to the proper nuclear family parental script. But the dynamic between Black women and their children can often be a difficult one, where Black women having to endure so much racism and sexism and having to work so hard often to provide for their whole households don't get to exhibit, or not in the same way as white women could often exhibit, like their love for their children. And so Hill Collins here invokes Toni Morrison's Sula to talk about the case of the character Eva, who describes how she essentially needs to postpone both her anger to the world and her affection for her children because she's too busy working. And there's this moment in the book when her child, I think, is like, why weren't you nice to us when we were kids? And she was like, what? How? How? I'm working 16, 17-hour days every day, and when I get home, I can like barely even like keep my head in order. I don't have a deep reservoir for like the kind of affection that is normalized on like TV with rich middle class families that are able to allocate tons of time together and have a lot of disposable income to get other people to take care of their chores for them. Like, this isn't always a privilege open up to people, and within a capitalist framework in which people are expected to provide for themselves, otherwise they just perish and they're provided almost nothing, they don't have the time to really allocate to like these deep demonstrations of love and affection to their children, while that love and affection is nevertheless there, of course. So while it might appear in this case in the book Sula that Eva's child is like upset with Eva, Eva's like, I did all of this out of an abundance of love, not an absence of it. And that puts us here into chapter 9, Rethinking Black Women's Activism. So reflecting on Sarah Brooks's life, Black women have not had the opportunities to perform political activism in the quote-unquote right ways. Now, for many different people, Sarah Brooks was a quote-unquote domestic who's working in white homes, but her survival, and many, in the case of most Black women, like their survival is their activism. So for people who have like jobs and have disposable income and can do activism in a way that's perceived to be like the right kind of community building activism, or it's attacking the right kind of like systemic pressure points, that is in itself in some cases a privilege. Like, not everybody has the bandwidth and the time just simply to engage in that kind of work. Hence why it is the work of the people with the most privilege to take this on, while also acknowledging that their knowledge systems, their beliefs, are likely going to be influenced by various other oppressive dynamics in other cases. Hence, it's not just them, the most privileged, that get the final word here. Of course not. But they should be the foot soldiers of what the most oppressed people are describing as being the problem and who the oppressors are. So one of the ways that activism would look is like Black women working in white homes would just transform daily routine or schedules, or they would just in a daily day-to-day basis like resist the expectations put upon them by the family employing them, which to many, in certain like privileged activist circles, wouldn't be seen as the right kind of activism. It would be seen as just like an individual tactic. It is still nevertheless a political one, in that this is a common strategy by Black women. This isn't just like an individualized random aberration. It is part of a broader mode of survival, which by its very nature then is activist and it is political. So in some of these contexts, Black women would recognize their value in those settings, and they would use that to negotiate better working conditions, more pay, minuscule, granted they aren't getting a lot of pay increases, or they would try to shatter the white self-image of progressivism by deliberately dressing poorly, which is something that Hill Collins stresses, where one of the tactics was for Black women to like deliberately embrace the very oppression that they were experiencing in those settings by making it totally apparent that many of these families, despite believing themselves to be the cool white progressives that they are, were actually participating in the same kind of oppression of Black women that they had been enduring under segregation, under enslavement, and this is a continuation of those legacies. And Black women's community support is also a kind of activism. It's necessary, and it is activist in that it is working together towards common objectives. It is also resistive, of course. And they've even needed to exercise this resistance in civil rights spaces where Black men's experiences are taken as the kind of norm and natural experiences of racism at the expense of Black women's specific experiences. And we've seen that throughout the history of the Black rights movement, through civil rights movement, it has mostly been men that have been the leaders, and mostly men that have been the spokespeople of these movements, obviously revealing that these movements, as important as they are, haven't always accounted for those specific experiences of Black women. So Black women's relationship to like education has also been a site of struggle through the adoption and readaptation of hegemonic European educational standards. So for example, Black women apply the European historical method, like writing a European idea of the past, where there's just like what we are experiencing now, and then everything that comes before it is like a kind of haze that needs to have select moments sort of picked out to provide a linear narrative from which to like justify our existing in the moment, like everything that led up to this. But of course, this is a very selective history. Like we mentioned before, we learn about all the rich white guys. Like that is what we are then taken to be our lineage, like what led us to this point. And this is why it's so important to problematize the way we tell the past, because that's obviously going to inform the future. So Black women would often renegotiate this and just like they would keep the same kind of method, the way of understanding the past in this way, by highlighting certain stars and be like, these are the key points and people, but then just adding Black women. And that it reveals, like, of course, this is intolerable. So, of course, in these spaces, in academic spaces, you have figures like Ida B. Wells, Angela Davis, Mary Terrell, and so many others that participated in turning the colonial and white supremacist gaze back on itself to be like, look, if you're going to use these methods, it only follows that the same can be applied and the same can be done with these figures instead of the ones that you've exalted and celebrated for centuries. And this disrupts this narrative. This is like also the case of the adoption of like Christianity among many colonies that were set up by various different European colonizers. And this is something that Homi Bhabha writes about and others, to say that this, despite Europeans often engaging in their violence in the name of God, saying that they're trying to spread the word of God and Christianity, at least how the Europeans in part justified their colonial expansions, as soon as colonized people begin to take up these texts and scriptures, suddenly this does something. It does something to the Europeans because they no longer view themselves to be the one like true inheritors of God's word in the Christian God sense. And this ends up actually like disrupting their plan, because suddenly the people who they believe to be lesser than them suddenly have a relationship with God. Like that obviously is intolerable. And so it's in ways like these that activism and resistance can take on more nebulous, so they aren't quite like direct action approaches, even though direct action is extremely necessary. And this is like much of the importance of Frantz Fanon's work, including many others who have imagined what armed resistance to colonialism looks like. It's important to really acknowledge that resistance, like even in those more overt forms of counter-violence against colonizers, can only be sustained by much of the work that historically women, and in these contexts that Black women do, like caring for the children while there are people fighting against the enemy, preparing meals, doing the care work, which is like the necessary underwriting of those resistive movements. But this is often ignored or erased in history as a part of the sexist erasure of Black, racist and sexist erasure of Black women's contributions to activist struggles and to, like what Cedric Robinson writes about, to the Black radical tradition. And that puts us here into part 3, Black Feminism, Knowledge, and Power, with chapter 10, U.S. Black Feminism in Transnational Contexts. Now, one of the privileges of power is that it allows itself to go unrecognized. And this is how, like, a history textbook is not necessarily seen as a demonstration of power, but it really is. Because if you have a history textbook filled with white European dudes, no one bats an eye. But if you were to offer history textbooks in like somewhere in the US, in some public school, but it just included important Black historical figures in the same proportion as white ones, you would find that suddenly it's like, this is a sign of something. Like it's something to be interpreted as a problem. Whereas with white folks, it's not a problem at all, if it is just them within the history textbook. Now, there's also, beyond race, gender, class, we find like also national oppression, which Hill Collins emphasizes. Now, with a national image, certain people can be branded as outsiders. So the very construction of the nation is one of exclusion. Hence the supreme control that's been placed on women and women's bodies to make sure that when they reproduce, they do so in a way that to reproduce with a proper person, which is often just coded as being someone of the same race, to maintain the racial integrity of the nation, which is then used to justify the existence of a common bond among a people, at least in its most racist way, and therefore to justify the existence of that nation itself, which of course is just an imagined thing. This is like what Benedict Anderson writes about. He says that, nations aren't true, they're more imagined. So a way to illustrate this for you, if you're not familiar with that idea, I right now, I live in Canada, in a city in Canada. I have a lot more in common with someone in like Vermont than I do with someone who lives in like Texas or Louisiana or Missouri. And that goes to show that like our national differences don't mean a lot because I would have a lot more in common with somebody who's like geographically closer to me, even though they're in a different country, than I would with somebody who lives in Canada, in like Alberta. Chances are I won't have as much in common with them as I will someone from Vermont or Maine. It's kind of a, silly example, but just to illustrate how national boundaries are arbitrary and they don't really determine who a person is. And so because nations are such flimsy things in actually bringing people together and giving them a collective sense of identity, it is for this reason that nations use racism to maintain racial bonds in order to maintain some kind of an illusion of unity among a people. So within the US context, Black women are often framed as being outsiders within that dynamic. Same thing with Black men. Hence why when Black women are branded as being exploitative through welfare, like they exploit the welfare system, what the subtext is there is that they are not actually part of the national fabric. They are not deserving of government funds. Now, there was a case a few years ago of this, if anyone knows hockey, you probably know a guy named Don Cherry, who is a very famous Canadian hockey commentator. And a few years ago, he made a comment on the air about people not wearing the poppy, which is for Remembrance Day, for remembering World War II military veterans and World War I military veterans. And he made this comment that he sees people come here to Canada and he's like, they like to enjoy all the benefits of Canada and they don't even wear like a poppy. And this created quite a stir. And I think it created a stir for the right reasons. But many of the commentators sort of missed one important thing, and that is like his comment that he sees people who come here, which is a very interesting claim because he's implying that he can see difference. Of course, what he means is that he sees people of color. Like, you don't see difference in like any other way. But this just goes to show that in his mind, and he believes he's a real representative of like the elbows up Canadian identity. In his mind, to be white, it means to be Canadian. Whereas to be non-white, therefore to be seen as being different, means that you are different. This is one of the ways in which the nation normalizes, in this context, whiteness as being, and white people as being the proper inheritors of that national identity. National identity. And the same can apply to Black nationalism. Hill Collins is clear, has not always included Black women's input. Ideas about a Black national struggle or the need for a Black nation to fight against like historical white supremacy. Obviously, these are very important ideas, and they're meeting a very urgent demand, but they have often come without actually consulting Black women. And so Hill Collins is like, what kind of nation will this be? Is it one that's going to continue the legacy of the exploitation of women's labor and bodies? If that's the case, it's like, okay, obviously we can recognize its importance and the challenges and the problems that it is going to remedy, but it's going to replicate other ones too that need to be accounted for, need to be addressed. So Black women then occupy this they don't fit in with like American nationalism, nor do they fit in with Black nationalism or with a romanticized, single, homogenous like Black identity embraced among the Black African continent, which is part of some strands of like, I guess, Black thought that has historically excluded women, but has also participated in certain colonial fantasies about like a homogenous Black identity, which of course is not true at all. Africa's huge. There's millions of different Black identities there, obviously. So Black women don't get to fit in anywhere. They don't even get to fit in with the status of being a woman, like what that means. Hence Sojourner Truth's speech, Ain't I a Woman? And they don't even get to really fit in with the experience of being Black, insofar as that experience, as it is popularly understood, centers Black men's experiences. So Black women, and this is really the need to define the struggle, to define the experience, and to define the self and the community, to oppose the direct imposition of stereotypes by white supremacist authority, but also the systematic denial of Black women from any of these other kinds of communities and groups and collective identities around like the nation or anything else. So this does encourage, or should encourage, Black women's solidarity on a global level, because much has been decided about them without their input, and hence the collective organization of Black women's labor and bodies in a way that can systematically oppose this trend would obviously be beneficial in inserting Black women into these conversations. So like, even if you look at conversations around economic exploitation around the world, Black women's place here is really ambiguous in like global production. And this can also extend to Asian women, to Mexican women. Like the same thing can be applied here, where if there are intensified calls for production, like by capitalists, this means that these women are going to be more exploited. Whereas calls against consumerism or of decoupling the West from exploitative labor processes overseas will often mean that women globally are put into even more precarious positions because of the nature of globalized capitalism that has rendered so many parts of the world just destitute, just reduced it to the bare minimum of terms of financial compensation, and made those people dependent upon their wages, which is a very important idea from Marx. Marx says that one of capitalism's nefarious tools is to take away people's ability to provide for themselves. So in various contexts where the West has exploited different parts of the world, has taken its resources and exploited its labor, calls to oppose that don't actually factor in the people who are going to be affected by those calls, like either to intensify production or to reduce it, it's just going to continue these legacies, and it's going to continue the assumption that these are places that don't have a voice and therefore are deserving of a new kind of exploitation just down the road or down the line. And it's not like Black women or women all around the world have an easy time accessing like visas to go and work in other places. Like the very visa process and the way that national visa processes work, they're extremely sexist. Like even there are some going into, like from Canada, I know this because I had to do this a few years ago, Canada going into the US, if you look at the visa processes, it's often made, the subtext is extremely gendered. So there are certain visas in which you can apply and bring a partner, and the kinds of jobs that your partner is able to do are highly gendered. Like they can be a nanny, or they can be like a house cleaner. Like, and it just assumes that, like if you look up like a TN visa, which is the one I did, going from Mexico or Canada into the US, it is one that it just maintains these gendered divisions, assuming that the breadwinner is going to be somebody who's doing a job, and their partner is open to doing like nannying or like housework, which of course is highly gendered. And we see that it's obviously so much more difficult for women to access like visable jobs, given like histories of negligence, histories of exclusion of Black women from education, from accessing these resources, and of course making them responsible for like caring for the home, which is it's just a job in itself. And that puts us here into chapter 11, Black feminist epistemology, or epistemology here refers to the process of knowledge building. Black feminist epistemology asks, like, what do we understand by Black women's knowledge? How is it produced? How is it spread? And also, how does Black feminist epistemology or Black women's knowledge disrupt what is taken to be the natural or normal way to acquire and to spread knowledge, like white knowledge, and it has to be spread through schools or academia to be taken seriously. So Black feminist epistemology questions these relationships, these understandings of knowledge. So Black women's knowledges are subjugated when white dudes comprise the majority of academic positions. It will obviously in those contexts be difficult for Black women to have their voices heard. It's a very common thing, like for dudes. And one of the ways that this manifests for men is the way in which they employ their critical arsenal, where they'll listen to another white dude speak and they'll never question anything they say. But as soon as women speak, especially black women, they're going to suddenly be interrogated. Every little point they make is going to be suspect. It's going to need to be justified. It's going to need to be defended, which is a very exhausting thing to have to do, obviously. It's very exhausting. It's very, it's dehumanizing. It's also like deflating because it takes a lot of work. And the assumption is that your knowledge is just always open to criticism or open to interrogation. And black women endure this challenge in a space that has already like diagnosed black women as being problematic, and there being problems within black communities. So Oyewumi writes about this. Oyewumi, who wrote The Invention of Women. At the beginning of The Invention of Women, which I've covered on this channel, if you want to go check it out, you should read it. But if you don't have the time, in The Invention of Women, Oyewumi talks about at first the way in which social science research often just takes black communities as problematic. And so it looks at black communities as like a problem that needs to be solved, kind of like the Moynihan report I talked about before. So it'll look at black communities and it'll talk about like substance use rates, like poverty, like crime, etc. When that's actually really interesting, because the people inflicting the most harm on the world and doing the most violence are like the weapons manufacturers in the US, are the arms dealers in globally, are the finance bankers that are plummeting the world into continued like economic strife. But when we bring up conversations of crime, those people you never fill in their faces in those conversations. The assumption just is to immediately go to, like in some context, go to black folks and being like, that is where crime exists, or that's where XYZ exists. And so we see that the recurrence, or we see the repetition of racist stereotypes, even within academic spaces, that sometimes are trying to even oppose those trends. So against these perspectives, against these abstracted ways of looking at black women and black communities, where you often have like white researchers treating these people as test subjects, treating these people as just objects to be studied instead of people themselves, Hill Collins opposes that with black feminist standpoint theory that says like there's a lot to be taken and learned from black women's individual experiences in order to bring them into a kind of archive, into a repository of similar experiences, to better make sense of these broader political trends and exploitations of black women that, you know, for all the changes that academia should undergo, it's like ability to collect testimonies can be really useful in this kind of dynamic, or to reveal these kinds of oppressions. So Hill Collins characterizes black women's epistemology as a culture of communication grounded in experience, not abstract metaphors. It is very much as a standpoint theory, it takes like experiences as being the starting point. It doesn't take like abstracted or stereotyped ideas about people, like crime in black neighborhoods, for example, as being like the starting point, as though there's a problem here. Instead, standpoint theory would say, I just want to listen. Like, I want to hear your testimony and understand your experience. So black epistemology, or black feminist epistemology, is also connected to a black ethic of caring that prioritizes, in her words, individual expressiveness, the appropriateness of emotions, and the capacity for empathy. Now, it's important not to go in the extreme in the other direction and think that because black women are historically one of the most subjugated and oppressed groups, that therefore their experiences can speak to every other group's experiences. Like, that would be a big mistake. Of course, standpoint theory acknowledges that Different people, different groups have different experiences, and they can't just be translated to one another. To do so would be to do a violence to the specifics of those experiences. And that puts us here to the final chapter, chapter 12, towards a politics of empowerment. So to understand what Black women are up against, it demands an engagement with, in her words, the matrix of domination that is comprised of 4 main domains of power. And they are structural, that is how power is organized and how oppression is organized. Disciplinary, that is how oppression manages the people it oppresses. The hegemonic, and this is the academic, the political, the journalistic justification of oppression. And finally, the interpersonal domain that influences everyday lived experiences. And you find that, or at least Hill Collins illustrates these 4 as forming the important quarters of what is required to maintain the oppression, the systemic oppression of a group, which means maintaining structural oppression, means maintaining academic oppression, means maintaining public opinion oppression, means maintaining interpersonal oppressions and racisms in order to continually subjugate these people. Where Black women's rights have been largely accumulated only not through like revolutionary opposition to this matrix of domination, but instead most of Black women's progress has come about through reform, which reveals that, it's such an annoying litmus test. If you're ever in a space where someone is like, are you a reformist or a revolutionary? It's one of the most frustrating questions to get because it's very much European coded, where it's like saying there's a right way to be an activist when it's obviously seen that if your goal is to improve people's lives, like in a material way, that can look like reform, and how many different revolutions and revolutionary transformations happen through reform, various different reforms. I don't prescribe to this distinction like at all. And I find it to be an annoying Marxist litmus test that often just excludes what is perceived to be the not proper kind of struggles. So Black women have very successfully made strides to improving their conditions. They've started to earn more lucrative employment to be able to provide for themselves and their families in ways that's more sustainable. And this is like their revolution, even if it doesn't map on to the hegemonic conception of what revolution can look like. So with this is shown like the power of small struggles, the power of individual struggles, the power of incremental reforms and transformations in creating a better world, while also acknowledging that there's still a lot to be done, obviously. And of course, it's not as though everything's just suddenly good for Black women. They encounter racism every single day and sexism every single day. They encounter new barriers. They encounter bureaucratic kinds of oppressions that often exploit their subject position to make them do the worst work or the most annoying work, or they take on disproportionate tasks. Like, these are still very much present. But she leaves us off on a hopeful note that, like, in roles such as these, Black women find new opportunities to appropriate these bureaucratic structures and mechanisms, perhaps for better ends, which is very hopeful. Ultimately, I think that the end of the bureaucratic structuration of work, of labor, should end. Like, that should be one of our goals. But in any case, for people to be taking on these roles as modes of survival, given the historical legacy of disenfranchisement, of enslavement, of sexism, of course, the Black women taking on these roles are not the problem. They aren't the problem. That must be acknowledged when thinking about what harm reduction and what revolution can really look like, while also not just romanticizing the presence of Black women or Black people in powerful positions and taking this as a sign that racism is over. Obviously not. It's important to hold on to all of these things at once. And yeah, that'll pretty much wrap it up. If there's anything I got wrong or anything I excluded, I'd love to hear about it. I mean, I'm no replacement for you having read the book. I'd really recommend you read it. It's really great. But yeah, let me know what you think. If you have any comments, I'd love to read them. And yeah, if you like what I did, there are links in the description. Consider donating to one of the organizations I've listed first. And then, yeah, on that note, hope you're all doing well. Take care.